Hey, Melissa, how's it going today?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I am very excited to have you on Turtz this week to discuss grief. And as we go through that, just a reminder this episode of Turtz represents our opinions, mine and Melissa's. And neither of us are healthcare or mental health care professionals. So this information is solely for educational and entertainment purposes. Should anything resonate in this episode, I definitely recommend that you seek health or mental health care providers to discuss it further. And if you have more questions, feel free to visit turtz.com/privacy. So, Melissa, I want to dive in with you on grief. And I think the best way to do that is to start with defining grief. What would you define grief as?
One of the things you and I have always talked about is that grief is so multi-layered and grief can be so many different things. So it would be the loss of a loved one, the loss of a physical relationship. It could be the demise or transition of another relationship or time of life or person, place, or thing. So I would just say that grief is the feeling of anguish, anxiety, feelings of depression, and just a feeling of emptiness that takes on both physical and emotional pain for people. It's something that we all experience at some point in our life, but it is not just the loss of a person. What I've seen a lot in my work is that grief impacts everybody, but it really is something that we feel both emotionally and physically that we all experience.
I would definitely agree with that. And I think a lot of times in my therapy journey, I've thought about losing relationships or separating in relationships as a grieving process, grieving the loss of something in general. And I think it is a very difficult thing to process yourself, let alone grief counseling. And so I would be curious, how did you get into grief counseling?
So I think since I was little, I would always say, oh, I wanted to be a spiritual counselor. I kind of understood. I had gone to counseling when I was really young for things that I had gone through. And so I'd always understood what a counselor was. But from as early as I can remember, I was always drawn to people in grief. I don't think I recognized it as any different. I thought everybody felt that way. So if you're around someone that had recently lost a loved one, I was kind of drawn to comfort. That was always something that I was very comfortable with. And I never recognized that everyone wasn't like that. I just thought you wanted to be there to comfort. There was almost a physical element. I wanted to hold their hand or hug them or something. When I was 22, I just graduated undergrad and I was kind of looking into going to become a social worker, and I was in the ICU. My brother had had some internal bleeding and he was fine, but I was visiting him. And as we were in there, we walked by a man. If you've ever been in an ICU, it's like curtains around. They're not all hospitals have individual rooms. And they had pulled him out, and over the hospital system, they're saying code blue, code blue. And I watched them try to revive this man. He unfortunately passed. We were right there, we were close to it. And I looked over into the waiting room and could see his mom and his wife at the time. And instinctively, I went over to them and just put my arms around them, grabbed his wife's hand, and just like rubbed their back. I don't actually even remember what I do. It was one of those times where you kind of like whatever internally took over and I just went with it. And my mom at the time was like, why don't you look at being a hospital chaplain? So the social work, I wanted to do counseling in that. And hospital chaplain, is you're heavily involved in life and death. And I was like, okay, that's great. So literally within weeks, I was in a program getting my master's in pastoral care and counseling and theology and on my way to becoming a hospital chaplain, where there was so much training on grief and bereavement and something that we had to deal with and got to be a part of on a daily basis. So it kind of was something that inwardly I was so drawn to. And I've never not been drawn to it, but that really solidified it. And it kind of just took off from there.
And were you always involved with religion prior to this experience?
Faith has always been so important to me. It's interesting as I've gone through my own healing later in life as an adult and had children of my own, and I have so many memories now that I don't know if I either suppressed them or just different things. You kind of look back and you're like, oh my gosh, I totally remember that. But I had very vivid dreams as a child. I was very aware of different energies as a child and could feel darkness, could feel love and light. And so when I was little, I always had to pray to feel safe. I remember always praying to God and and always asking someone to be with me, always asking the angels to protect me. I always did that. So that's something from an early age. I was raised Catholic. God was a part of everything I did and felt and experienced. So bringing it into the grief world, bringing it into my life, it was part of my identity. It still is. The faith aspect, it has evolved and changed over time, and I want to say it is less changed than it's just expanded to see how big God is to me and how much He's a part of everything. I was technically a Catholic hospital chaplain. All the chaplains were of different religions and backgrounds, which was incredible to work with, see, and experience. And, obviously all your patients were not Catholic. So we always wanted to show up for what was best for them.
When you look back at your grief counseling when you were 5, what was that experience like for you then? And how do you look back on it now?
It just felt very natural is the only way I know how to say it. Back then, being drawn to the grief just felt like comforting. If I was a child to describe it, you just felt very drawn to hug and to hold people and hold space, which is obviously evolved over the years, and that looks very different now. But back then, I just always was drawn towards it. Early on, I remember thinking, like, why am I drawn to this? But there was something, I don't want to say appealing, it just felt natural. So
Mhm.
that always has been the case. With all healing and all healing modalities, you realize you have to kind of face your own healing in all the ways and your own grief of various source that I didn't, acknowledge, work through all those things. So as I went through that process, I think I was able to see and experience more of what I was supposed to do because I got more clarity as I was open to using different healing modalities to heal myself. There was a time I took a period off of grief counseling, having children and stuff, because it does take a lot out of you. And I always want to say it's an invitation to be invited into that sacred space because suffering and grief is such a vulnerable, sacred place to me. So if I've been invited into that space, it is an invitation by someone. And I always want to show up and be more of a conduit or vessel for it. Now, at this point in my life, grief counseling is I kind of made that pact with God. So now grief counseling looks like, from my perspective, whatever He wants. I'm going to show up and be open to it, but it has expanded more than I could imagine. People always say, how do you do that? That's got to be the worst job ever. Oh, and I still go back to when I was 5, and it just feels really natural.
I think having experienced a version, and we'll get into that in a second, but a version of grief counseling with you, I really struggled with the loss of my grandparents. And I really struggled because I lost them both in a very short period of time. And I also experienced the last days with them, which is an experience that I cannot explain. It was very therapeutic and healing for me to have been there. It was very hard to be there. And kind of like you said, there was some part of me that could compartmentalize my emotions and put them aside while they were passing to be able to be there for them in the way that they had been there for me my entire life. And I think when all that ended, I really struggled for a long time because I didn't know how to make sense of that. And I think from our conversations, I don't even know necessarily the process we went through to begin working through that in a different way. I would be curious if you could describe a little bit high level what that process looks like. I've experienced it, but I don't think I could explain it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Even you describing your grandparents and getting to say goodbye, but also like holding your own grief and knowing what that means when they leave, but being there for them and that love. And death is so excruciatingly painful at time, but it's also really beautiful, and you can see that
Yeah.
even as you describe it. And people think of death as how they see it in the movies, but really that transition is so beautiful. And it truly is
Yeah.
sacred ground. You're crossing over into what everyone would describe differently, but spirit or heaven, or in that, watching people and being invited into that space to watch people transition to that, I think is so sacred and so beautiful. And I think with you, like, even as you're talking, I feel the warmth of your grandparents, but the most beautiful thing I want to say right now is that they're not gone. Their soul, the most important part of them, hasn't left. Their physical body has left. And that's hard because we're physical beings, but we're actually spiritual beings in a physical world, which we've all heard a million times. But the process of seeing that is, yes, you physically have lost them here, but you have not lost their love. And not only their love, their perfect love, because my true belief is where our loved ones go. And when they do come back to connect, which your grandparents have, they're sending you signs, they're showing, you're feeling them, you're getting sense. We can talk about all the clairs, but those are just ways of communicating, right? Do you have a dream where they visit you in your dream? Do you have a moment where you smell your grandmother's perfume and know that she's there? Do you have a time where your grandfather's, you find a coin with a date that was important to him or a name or something, and all these beautiful things? And so what I see with that is, yes, they have physically left, but experiencing things with you or other friends or family or clients or whatever it is, and recognizing that their loved one is still very present, and they're going to use whatever language that they have to try to connect and to bring a message that they want to give to you, is, I think, one of the most beautiful things we could experience here. So we are all going to die. We all are going to lose someone. We all are going to go through suffering. It's what makes us human. And it's the one thing that we all do, no matter what, where we live, what culture we're a part of, who we are, how we were brought up. We all experience suffering and grief, and we all lose someone we love, but they don't go as far as we feel that they might. And that seeing that connection, being able to just talk to you and feel your grandmother, especially because she's the more bossy one, the prominent one, who kind of steps forward more so. But I love it because she also, in my experience with this, is she also steps forward more because you may need her the most and you may feel the most safe with her. There's something beautiful about the love that was shared here, and it just multiplies when it's there. And when they come through, they know what you need, more than I could ever. We always laugh about the word, but that's where the medium comes in. It really is just a medium to get information from them to me to give to you. Everyone has that ability to connect and feel them, but they're so beautiful in the way that they will find the language in the signs and the ways to get it to you in the way you need it most.
Yes. And I think that your energetic connection is very interesting. And I want to dive into that a little bit further. But
Okay.
before we do, I want to just get a baseline of prior to the infusion, I'll say, of energetic connection when you first started. What was that grief counseling like? And then when did you realize that you were starting to transition to add more of that language into your grief counseling?
That's a great question because it made me think a lot. So when I was in the hospital, it would be like you could have one day where you lost 8 patients. I was in the trauma room, so you'd get traumas coming in, and I'd have to call the family and let them know, like, hey, you need to come down as soon as you can. And a majority of the time, if they're coming in trauma, a lot of them were rushed off into emergency surgery, calling the parents, going through, literally at that time, going through their phones, trying to find their parent and give them information, but not too much, but get them in. And then I was the person that would meet them when they'd come to the hospital waiting for their loved one. And I was 24. I hadn't had that experience. My first day on the job, my first hour, I had an 90-year-old man whose son was in a motorcycle accident and died. And I was comforting this 90-year-old man. I was 24 years old. I didn't have children at the time. I didn't know, but I remember that day just being like, okay, God, work through me. And I just showed up, and I think I sat with him for an hour and a half, and I held his hand, and I talked with him. Did I know what to do? Absolutely not. But I tried to just surrender to the fact that I was being guided by a love so much bigger than me, and by a love that loved this man. And for my way to explain it, from my experience of it, is that I said, okay, God, I'll show up and work through me. And he kind of guided me with how to be there for him. And because I was so inept, meaning like I didn't know what to do. A week later, I had to comfort a mom who had just lost her baby. There's no way to prepare you. There's no way to train for that. I took tons of classes on grief and bereavement. I took tons of classes and did different certifications. And you can do all these things where you're told how to be and what to do and how to act in those traumatic situations of loss, but you kind of show up. And so I think I was so dependent on trusting that I was being guided by something higher that I just did that, and following the intuition of like, please go hold his hand or rub their back or offer them space. you're also so terrified to mess up. This is the worst day of this person's life normally. You're coming in and you're just wanting to offer love and care. And so, in that way, I still take that into my practice. I think over time, I started to recognize. I was on the oncology unit one day in the hospital. I remember they asked for prayer. So I put my hands on them to pray. And they looked at me so angry. What are you doing? And I was like, oh my gosh, what do you mean? What am I? I'm not doing anything. And they're like, oh, I can feel that. And I was like, oh my gosh, I promise I won't touch you. I'll put them up here. But my experience of that was just like the Holy Spirit or God or spirit or however people want to call it. It was just that power of there being another presence there, a loving, a bigger, a more divine presence. My uncle, I remember when I was 11 or 12, we went to visit him. I remember that day and I remember just like sitting with him on the couch. And I remember just thinking, I need to spend as much time with my Uncle Mario today as possible because this is going to be the last time I see him. And even at the time when I look back, I didn't feel deep grief about it. It was just truly a knowing. And I remember my dad that night was like, oh, Liz, you were so sweet with Uncle Mario today. And I remember being like, oh, like, of course like, he's gonna die this week. But I didn't say that because at that time, I thought everyone knew that. You know what I mean? I thought everyone had that knowing. And he did pass that week. And so fast forward 10, 12 years later, I'm in the hospital and I would get those inklings again. I started getting, I would just say information. So a kind of a knowing sometimes. Then as I kind of opened up to that a little bit more, I have 4 children and I'm so blessed, but I had 5 miscarriages and not early ones always. I would have dreams. I knew sometimes I was going to lose the baby. I knew those. I had dreams I would have boy girl twins. There was all these like kind of things that would come in my moments of grief. And as I later started to heal back to the information, I would get more and more information. And then it started being like, who's this? And who's this person? And what are they saying? And they're telling me something. Should I tell this person? I would be at a dinner party and be like, so Charles, there's this woman here that is very insistent that she's your favorite and you love her, and it would be your grandma. It would have these beautiful moments of healing. So I wasn't technically doing grief counseling, but I was able to bring through a message that that person needed at this time, or they hadn't or needed for years, and it opened something up. I started recognizing, oh, if this information is healing. And then that was my prayer, like, okay, well, I will share more information as long as it's covered in love and brings healing. All right, God, let's go again. Over the last 2 years, I went back into grief counseling, and it has been the most incredibly beautiful thing to be able to show up. And then you're able to offer messages from their loved ones. Like sometimes it's
Mhm.
something they needed to hear. It's someone that they had passed 20 years ago that was a friend that they ended on a bad note. And this person wanted to be like, hey, I forgave you. It's such a gift to be able to blend if needed, both being able to show up for someone and being invited in and then giving information that does bring healing.
Yes. And I having experienced that with you, I remember saying to you, I didn't even know I needed to hear that. And sometimes it wasn't even a message per se. It was just you knew the right thing to say in that moment. And it was out of context, but it was there. I appreciate you sharing your story with growing your family and how difficult that was. As you experienced it yourself, how did you process that grief of losing a child?
When I was in the hospital, fetal demise, the loss of a baby was something we did baptisms for babies that were about to pass or blessings if they had passed. And so I'd been around a lot of families, unfortunately, that had experienced that. And I just remember being like, how could they go through this? So I had a dream and I knew God told me you were going to have twins, like these boy girls. So I like held on to my faith in that way and trusted that I was going to have the family that I was supposed to have. But it was hard being able to see so many people go through it. I had so much empathy and compassion for them that I tried to extend that to myself during that time. But it was scary and it was hard. I had seen so many people go through that and my heart broke for them, but they got through it and their resilience. And you kind of knew it's going to work out the way it should. But it was hard.
I think we're all trying to figure it out each and every day. And I think one thing that you said that resonated for you, that also resonated for me, was giving you hope. And I think the loss of my grandparents would traditionally put into a grief category. But I also had grief with friendships and relationships and family members. And I think the hope is really what I took out of a lot of our conversations.
Mm.
And I think in holding on to the hope, there's just that little almost hair of support that somehow starts to create that level of a foundation to build upon to go through the grief. And people say all the time heals all wounds. And I don't think that's true as a saying. I do believe that in time you will heal the wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for time to heal all wounds, the bigger premise is that you have to grieve, you have to accept, you have to understand, you have to process. And for me, that was very different because it was new to me. It was not something that I could fix or change or process with someone because I grieved them after I lost them. I hear a lot that people, when they know that the end is coming, they're able to process. And for me, as I went through that experience, I didn't process it.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that it was coming and I did not even think about it. It was the here and the now and the being with them that was more important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that made my grief a little trickier because I had beautiful conversations with them, but they weren't a grieving conversation, a coming to acceptance of that conversation. What advice would you give someone that may be grieving and doesn't necessarily know where to start?
Just show up and enter into that space. Find if it's a friendship, if it's a meditation or prayer routine, if it's being with other loved ones in solidarity that has also lost this person, if it's going to a counselor, if it's going to get Reiki, if it's going on a run. Everyone copes differently, right? But it's going to that place and just showing up to be open to recognize that you have to grieve. It doesn't look the same for everybody. And I always get like, I don't want to say bothered, but people are like, they think it needs to look a certain way. And I just hate that because we're all so different. Sometimes the grief is grieving the relationship that didn't exist here that you wanted. Sometimes it is grieving this amazing person that you held in the highest esteem and that loved you. And then sometimes it's grieving someone that was awful to you. And you have to grieve not only that they're gone, but that they never said sorry for being terrible. And so I think just showing up and going to that space to release. I remember back in graduate school, someone was doing a special talk on bereavement and they said like grief is like credit card debt. You can put it off, but it's always going to be there. And usually when you go to pay it off, it's so multi-layered and it's so much bigger than it was. It becomes bigger and scarier the longer you avoid it. And also with the different grief that you've experienced is there's healing, and healing is really, really profound and it's really beautiful. And healing allows us to open up ourselves. The more healed you are, the more you're able to extend your healing to other people, which is a beautiful thing. And I always think that's always so beautiful when people take their own pain, their grief, their loss, get through some of the healing and are able to then extend it outward because that heals you too. And in being with people to heal, it also heals us.
I think something that you said resonated so much within all of that. When you're grieving, it is like credit card debt. And I think for me, where my depression came in grieving the loss of relationships that I was never going to have, that compounded and it almost built up layer over layer over layer over layer. And then another piece of grief came in. And so as I peeled back the layers and I thought I was grieving one thing and it actually was another. And I think being patient with yourself and understanding that the longer you let the grief fester, the harder it is to remove layers of grief because it grows exponentially. And I think that analogy is so brilliant because that is what it's like. And it can get very dark very quick because the layers add up faster than you think.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me with you in our conversations, there was always, as you described, that connection, that feeling of holding space. There were just times where the space that you held was the space that I needed to be held for a second. I needed someone else to hold the weight just so that I could take a deep breath before I went back and worked through things. I've become interested in so many different modalities. And when I first reached out, I had no idea what to expect. I was going in, I was in a place in my life where I was just like, literally let go and let God. Like I was just in that place where I was I am just giving in, and like whatever comes across my plate, I am taking the opportunity. And I'm so thankful for the recommendation to speak with you. I think something that you talk about so beautifully and so effortlessly is sort of this mediumship or energetic connection. I struggle to talk about it in my life because I'm still trying to make sense of things that you've said where I know there's no way that you could know, and yet somehow you're able to describe it in a way that was as if you were there. What was it like to come out of the proverbial medium closet, if you will, and be so comfortable talking about this with so much religion in your background with your family?
I've had some beautiful moments with my parents, but I remember the first time I kind of hinted at it. I said something like, "Hey guys, like sometimes I see stuff." And then my parents are like, "Oh yeah, when you were little, we used to catch you like praying and talking to people." Like, would have been nice to know, guys. But one of the most interesting things is my dad and I have a very emotional connection. And Uncle Mario, the one I shared with before, he raised my dad really. So he was like a father to my dad. So he's more like a grandfather, really. There was able to be some beautiful things that he shared that I kind of gently would go to lunch with my dad and ask my dad about questions, or I'd say, "Oh, I had a dream." So coming out, I was actually the biggest baby about. So like instead of saying like Uncle Mario came to me and shared this things, I was like, "Hey dad, I had this dream."
I can relate. That was like, this is my friend. It was very obvious that it was someone that I was dating, but I was like, this is a friend.
Okay, I love it. I love it. Right? Yeah, it's true. It's just you're just leaving out some details. So I love that. This is my friend. That's exactly. I was same exact thing. So I used to get smells as a little kid, and I could smell danger, and I'd be like, this is someone I need to pray for protection right now or stay away from. I could smell goodness and be like, oh my gosh, this person, there's angels around them, or they're safe. And I remember reading about one of the saints, and I remember telling my parents, like, basically all the Catholic saints had mediumship gifts. And even in the Bible, they talk about the gift. They talk about the gift of prophecy, praying in tongues, all these different beautiful gifts of the Spirit. And that's what I still believe. And I believe that with God, his love is endless and boundless. So I kind of did that with my parents, and they kind of knew where it was going, but we all kind of stopped the conversation. And then my mom had a work thing that she was really stressing about. And my mom kept being like, okay, this isn't working and we need this approval for this hospital. And I got the clearest download. It's gonna work, Mom. Don't stress about it. And I kind of get these weird visions of it. So I didn't want to scare her, but I was like, Mom, it's gonna work. It's gonna open Monday. It's gonna be okay. They showed me, and like she's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Just trust. Like God showed me directly. It will work." Kind of trying to make her comfortable with it. So we laugh about it. We're leaving dinner, and my grandfather showed up, and I was like, "Mom, can I share with you what he's saying?" So it wasn't long, but it was like 5 or 10 minutes, and I just kind of shared with her, and I started to recognize a certain cadence in my voice that was him. I was trying to mimic him because it kind of feels like charades a little bit, like you're impersonating a little bit, not to be confused with channeling. I wasn't channeling. I was just getting information and trying as fast as I could because he was talking so fast. And it just comes out of me. And my mom's like, okay. And I could tell my mom was like, okay, she didn't know what to think. But I also know that some of the things he told her were exactly what she needed to hear, because it's probably one of the proudest moments in her career. My mom's an incredibly successful businesswoman, and she's worked her butt off, and she's doing amazing things. And he was able to share that with her. This is what I prayed for your whole life, and here you are doing it. And I like am exploding. Like it was almost like he couldn't stop talking about how proud, and there was some more details in there. So that was Thursday night. Saturday, they're at this said hospital that she's at, and she's doing something to try to get it ready. Still stressed, it's not going to open. She's texting me, Liz, okay, what did you say about it? What did we need to do to get it? And I was like, again, not my information, but here it goes again. So she's in a room, and this woman comes in, and this woman's like, "Ugh, my hand keeps shaking." And she's like, my mom's like the boss of this whole thing. So and my mom's, I love her so, so much, but she's intimidating. She is, she's a ball buster. And this woman goes, do you believe in mediums? This woman that she's never met before. And she goes, I am so sorry, but when my hand shakes, it's not going to go away until I share a message. Are you okay? And my mom said, okay. And she said, it's your dad. And the woman, a stranger, proceeded to give my mom the exact same reading I had given her Thursday night. And my mom said it was verbatim, down to the way I said certain things, down to the way I yelled certain things that he was saying, down to the exact wording that I had given her. I love that she got that hug from her dad and she got to hear things that she hadn't ever heard or at the time in her life, like that he could share that with her. That's the most importantly. But I was also like, yes, thanks guys. Thanks God. Because there's nothing that could have given my mom, I think, more confirmation of what I was doing than that. And I just felt so grateful. With that said, I'm very thoughtful about how and when I use words with my parents. But there was a beautiful synchronicity to it that I just felt like had to come from spirit, because you couldn't have planned that better to really share with my mom or dad what was going on or what I was doing. And now I'm working on doing it in general, but I'm still a total baby about it. I still have lots of friends, Charles.
In my experience and reflecting on what you just said and the story you told about your mom, as I said, there are things that you have said to me that have given me chills, or just was the thing I needed to hear in that moment, or just helping me trust my gut more and what I should be doing and how I should be doing it. For those listening, and I'm being just honest about how I view this, I think I've had my own experience and I'm putting that aside for a second. But I think at the end of the day, even in those moments of grieving with you, where I have just cried on the phone with you, even if that was it and it was surface level and you were just holding space for me, to me, there is so much healing in that. And then anything else is an added bonus. And I think sometimes when things don't necessarily go as planned and things don't necessarily work out the exact way you think they might, it's also hard to hold on to even those moments, because when you're grieving and when you're working through something and working on something, it's really hard when you have a setback that you can't control. And I think what's so beautiful about the story with your mom is that there was actually two healings with it. One was something going on with your mom, but it was also a building block to a more open conversation, more coming out of what you're doing with your life and career and how you're helping people, that allowed you to open that door fully, because it was almost double confirmation with her that you couldn't have paid someone to say it the same way that you said it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's the dichotomy of it where no matter what you take out of it, no matter which end of the spectrum you're on, there is healing in it and there is healing in the conversation. And you always say when you start, take what's relevant and leave the rest. And I never really realized until this moment that you're not really saying take what's relevant in the conversation and leave the rest. It's actually more emotional. It's more what helps you take a step further in your grief healing, in your grief counseling. It's not about the semantics and what's said and what's not said. It's about take out of this that you will leave a step further into grieving than you started. And I think that is what has really resonated with me from our conversation today, because sometimes when you're struggling with grief, things don't make sense, and having that support of clarity and just being able to trust and know that you're there, whether it's, I guess, symbolically rubbing my back since we're 3,000 miles away,
Yeah.
or having that difficult conversation. As we talked about your experience with your mom, what does it look like to work with you in this combination of grief counseling, mediumship, energetic connection, now that you're more out of the closet
Right.
than you were before.
When you talk about that situation with my mom, you're right. It was healing on so many levels. It was a foundation, and I needed that so much. And even as you're talking, I just have to say it because this is where like the almost like, okay, can feel it, is like showing up in that space at times is also, you have to, from the way I see it energetically, is that you're also held by so many loved ones and your own angels and your own guides and your grandparents, especially. And there's other family in there that have been there behind you. So that space I will always show up for, but my prayer is that you feel them because they're really wanting to be part of all of our grief and all of our healing and all of the things that to experience that love. So you not only invited me into that space, which I'm so grateful for and so honored, and also so hope I show up as authentically and open to whatever God and spirit need to you. But I do it with a whole team of people that love you and know you, that it create in me an instinctual love for you because the love of it's contagious. And I hope everyone can find their connection of communication with their loved ones and with God and with their angels and or whatever, however they communicate. You don't just get that space when you're in a counseling session or on the phone grieving. You actually get it by showing up to a space that they're all invited to as well. So when I do work with clients, first my question is like, who sent you? Because what did I do with them, and and what are you expecting? Because
I mean, you know what? I honestly, and I know I'm sorry to interrupt, but I actually think that if anyone reaches out to Melissa after listening to this, don't have any expectations. Don't think about it and just be open to it. And I think that that's so important because there have been times where Melissa has texted me in a moment where I could not have been struggling more. And it wasn't with grief, it was just, I was just struggling to figure out a next step. And there's no way to really describe what it felt like to get the text that was like, hey, are you okay? Do you want to talk for a couple minutes? And there was just something in that moment. I needed it so badly. And I think for me, that just trusting that that was what was meant to be and not trying to make sense of it, not trying to figure out like, how did she know? Did she feel it? Did someone tell? Like you could go on and on with that, but it didn't matter. It was just in that moment when I really needed that connection, it just felt like it dropped into my lap. And I think that is what a session is like with you on purpose, if that makes sense. And I think that's what's so beautiful about it, because there's so much on both sides of the here and the now, and then also the energetic connections and mediumship. The sessions go any which way and they go the way that they're meant to go. But there are some times where we just talked and it felt like a close personal friend that we were just talking through things. And I think the open mind to not having expectations and just seeing what comes out of it is what really allowed me to trust and believe and continue a conversation with you.
Oh, I love that. Well, and that I actually so appreciate you saying that. My prayer is that I'm of service to be what that person needs. If it is sitting and talking, if it's holding space, if it's praying together, if it's getting on the table and doing Reiki, or getting on the table and just praying over them, if it's laughing about certain things, if it's connecting with something they need clarity on, or maybe someone who wronged them and they need to release or forgive or whatever it is. And again, I'm not doing the healing. I am just showing up to be open to what that is. And even for the person coming in, I can't tell you how many times I've had people come in being like, I want to connect with this person and go about this. And I was like, I always tell people, I'm like, I have no control. I had one widow. She came in and she had kind of wanted questions about some other stuff. And it was interesting because her husband kept saying the same thing to me. And one of the things he kept saying was, tell her how thankful I am about how she raised those children. She raised them so good. I am so proud. I I fell in love with her watching the way she took care of them, and as a single mom, and she had 4 children, and did all this. It kind of kept almost being redundant. So I kept saying it only because he did not give me more information unless I kept saying that. So I was like, okay, fine, we'll do it. Deal. I'll keep saying this. And it was funny. She had other questions. And a week later, she texted me and she said, oh my gosh, I did not realize how much I worried that I did it all wrong after he passed. And I worried and judged myself and always thought I maybe wasn't good as a parent. And having him share that with me, I took a sigh of relief that I was okay. So, my point in being is she came for certain questions, but she actually got what in her heart her husband, God, knew she needed to hear to actually heal something so deep there that she had forgotten about. So,
Yeah.
yes, the expectation is hard, but also that's a lot of our ego, right? We want it to be a certain way. But when you kind of surrender, you're like, this is beautiful because there's parts in all of us that we need healed that we're not even aware of. But I love it all because to me, anything that's love and healing has to be from God. So I'm open to any of it and to whoever is supposed to be in that space with me, and that invites me into that space with them, which I'm so thankful for.
What would you say is a message that you would want to leave people with today?
God can heal anything in any parts of us. That doesn't mean pain goes away, and it doesn't mean discomfort is absolved, and it doesn't mean relationships still aren't hard. But I know that us showing up as our most healed version of ourselves for that season of life is our highest self, our most connected to God, our most connected to heal and help heal and bring love and to create that ripple where it spreads out. So I just encourage people from the smallest or greatest of griefs, or whatever it is, like there's nothing that can't be healed and worked through, and encouraging people to like lay it down because carrying it gets really heavy. It gets really layered and you add more pain, but also come when you're ready because I hate when people push people to go to a place we're not ready to go.
I actually fully agree with that. And as you were talking, one of the things that I was thinking about was hearing people share with me their experience as it relates to stories that I've told or episodes that I've done. Hearing people ask, what can I do to take a step forward to process this or process that? And I think for me, that has been so healing to be able to support through my experience. And by sharing that and having guests on who are sharing their experience, having that resonate with people, even if it's one person that says, okay, I relate to this too much. And I think I need to take a step in a different direction and start healing. To me, that is the greatest gift because it sparks something that allows them to start that journey. And with each episode, there's been someone who's reached out. I think to your point, I'm not saying it's going to be this podcast. I'm not saying it's going to be anything specific, but for everyone and for me, I know what my pivotal point was where I said, okay, I need to take a step in a different direction and figure this out. So I love that full message, especially the ending of you also can't force someone to do it.
Mm-hmm.
With the final question that I ask everyone, what is something that someone told you that impacted your life that you'll never forget?
This is going to sound kind of cheesy, but I'm going to say the company you keep, the people you surround yourself with can really elevate you. I think sometimes it's usually used in the negative influence, is why I'm saying this, is that don't underestimate the people around you that lift you up and how much influence they have on you and how much they help you grow and fill your cup. And how awesome is that when you get to exchange that sort of energy of growing and learning and wanting to raise people up, because all you're doing is raising up more people that are going to bring more love and more healing and more of all the good stuff to other people.
I love that. And I want to put a slight twist on the negative because as you were saying it, I think the company you keep is really important. I believe that life is a scale, and we all go through ebbs and flows of high points and low points, and depression and grief and happiness and joy and love. And I think that the company you keep is also potentially a reflection of what's going on in your own life.
So right.
You could be surrounding yourself with someone who you may be mirroring, or you're trying to stay in a relationship because how you want someone to heal is actually the healing you need for yourself. And I think that when you put the mirroring on it, it gives it a different perspective of the relationships and the psychodynamics of who you are and where you've been and how you're trying to heal. And it doesn't mean that they're bad or good. When you have the focus point of your healing journey, the mirror is either reflecting back to you what's going on in your life, or it's showing you a different path that you may be going down.
I love that. It's so true. I mean, and we all do it, right? The mirroring is really important and something that we all should be cognizant of in all things, right?
We play out our childhood trauma throughout our entire life until we understand it and can work through it. Melissa, I am so thankful for your time today and so appreciative that you joined us on the podcast. And truly thank you for sharing and for being so open about your life and the journey you've been on, as well as how you look at grief counseling, how you support it, and the unique closeted gifts that you have to be able to help people through grief.
No, thank you so much for having me. There's something so sweet about this, is because the first time we ever met, I remember where I was sitting, and I remember what your guides were showing me about your podcast, because you said, I'm going to do a podcast, and there was like I was like, oh, that's going to be really good. Like, it was, I still can see it so vividly, but it's such a neat thing how our relationship has evolved, and then being here doing it with you, and so proud of you, and it's such an honor to be on it. So thank you. Thank
Of
you.
course. And the last thing I'm going to add is that what was even more unique was that you actually didn't say that specifically. That's
Oh.
what you saw. No,
Oh.
it's very interesting, because for me, it was at a point where I was transitioning from a past career into starting my own business. And you said, okay, so what business are you working on? It feels like a creative project. And I had not told anyone that I was leaving. I said, I'm at my current employer. And you said, no, like, that's not what I'm seeing. And I just remembered feeling so confused, because you actually then described what you just said. And so for me, it was so interesting, because that was something that you couldn't have known at all.
Okay.
No one knew. And so you did say it, but you started differently and made the assumption that I was already doing it, because as you described, you could see it. So that's, to me, hearing it back, I'm like, oh, you have no idea how impactful that was, because it blew my mind that you knew.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Thank you for telling me that, because it's also the beautiful part, right? Like, it's information, and we're human. We don't always interpret it or understand it perfectly, but it was such a beautiful thing, which all of that working together, I loved. So thank you for sharing that. But that makes me laugh. But then I'm always like, gosh, I probably mess it up all the time. Well, here you are, and I'm so excited for you.